So, when the guns of World War II finally fell silent across Europe, you'd think that would be the start of a lasting peace, right? Well, not exactly. It was actually the beginning of a totally new kind of war, a cold one. Let's get into how the end of one massive global conflict basically lit the fuse for the next.
First, you just have to try and wrap your head around the sheer devastation. This number, 36 million, that's how many people died in Europe alone during World War II. An entire continent was left kneeling in the rubble, with a whole generation just scarred.
I mean, think about it. Cities were flattened, economies totally shattered, millions were homeless. The old way of doing things, the old world order, it was gone. And that left this huge power vacuum. The traditional powers of Europe just weren't in charge anymore, and something had to fill that gap. Turns out, two new giants were left standing.
All right, so for our first section, let's really look at this post-war landscape, because this is a story of how complete and utter destruction paved the way for a brand new and, frankly, a deeply dangerous ideological fight.
You can really see this shift right here. Back in 1939, the world pretty much revolved around powers like Great Britain, France, and Germany. But by 1945, Britain was basically bankrupt. France had been occupied, and Germany was defeated beyond recognition. And in their place, you get the United States and the Soviet Union, the new superpowers, just defined by their immense size, their population, and of course their military might.
But here's the thing. These two superpowers could not have been more different. We're talking oil and water here. Their entire worldviews were just fundamentally opposed. You had American democracy with its free elections and a free market. And on the other side, you had Soviet communism with a one-party dictatorship and an economy where the state controlled literally everything. This wasn't just a simple disagreement. These were two clashing, irreconcilable visions for humanity.
And really, it all boils down to this: the whole conflict. The US championed the rights and the freedoms of the individual person. The USSR, though, believed that the needs of the collective, the society as a whole, were way more important. And that single core conflict, it would fuel tensions across the entire globe for the next 45 years.
So that big ideological divide brings us right to our next part. You see, the alliance that defeated Hitler, it was never, ever meant to last. It was basically a ticking clock, and we're about to see exactly when and why it all blew up.
You know, this quote really hits the nail on the head. The United States and the Soviet Union were never friends, not even close. They were more like partners in a forced marriage, and the only thing that united them was the need to destroy Nazi Germany. As soon as that common enemy was gone, so was the glue holding them together.
And you can literally watch the relationship just fall apart in real time right here. At Yalta in February of '45, they were all smiles for the cameras, but behind the scenes, they were already arguing over what to do with Poland. By the time they meet again at Potsdam in July, everything's different. Roosevelt is dead, replaced by Harry Truman, who was much less willing to play nice. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. And then, just weeks later, the US drops the atomic bomb, a weapon developed in total secret. Any tiny scrap of trust that was left, it was just vaporized.
And this is where things get, well, impossible. Their goals for what to do with Europe after the war were completely at odds. The US wanted to rebuild Western Europe into a bunch of stable, democratic trading partners. But the USSR? They'd been invaded by Germany twice in 30 years. Stalin was obsessed with security. All he wanted was to build a buffer zone of loyal communist countries in Eastern Europe to protect his western border. Their two visions just could not coexist.
Then, in 1946, Winston Churchill comes along and gives this new, tense reality a name. Speaking in Missouri, of all places, he declares that an iron curtain had fallen, splitting Europe in two. On one side, you have the Free West. On the other, the nations of Eastern Europe, now totally sealed off under Soviet control. The phrase stuck because, well, it was true.
Okay, so for our final part, let's talk about how that metaphorical curtain became a very real, very hard, militarized reality, how it split a whole continent into two armed and deeply suspicious camps.
America's big response was a new policy they called containment, and it became official with something called the Truman Doctrine. What kicked it all off was Britain, who was broke from the war, saying they couldn't afford to help the Greek government fight off communist rebels anymore. So the US stepped in and basically declared, okay, from now on, we will actively step in to stop communism from spreading anywhere. It was a direct challenge to Stalin.
And they put their money where their mouth was. This wasn't just talk. We're talking $400 million right out of the gate, rushed over to Greece and Turkey.
America was drawing a very clear line in the sand.
But that was just the appetizer. The main course was even bigger. It was called the Marshall Plan, and it was basically an economic bazooka. $13 billion to rebuild the economies of Western Europe. The thinking behind it was pretty simple. People in prosperous, stable countries don't tend to vote for communism. It was an absolutely brilliant move to win hearts, minds, and, economic loyalty.
Now, you can probably guess how Stalin felt about this. He saw the Marshall Plan as an attack, calling it dollar imperialism. So his response was to just tighten his grip even more. He created these organizations, Cominform and Comecon, to make sure every communist party in Europe was loyal only to Moscow, and to lock all the Eastern European economies into a bloc with the USSR. He even forced countries like Poland to turn down American aid. It was a classic tit for tat. In all of this tension, it all came to a head in one city, Berlin. The first major crisis of the Cold War was about to explode, and it all started with a simple but deadly question. How do you take over a city without starting World War III?
Stalin's answer was the Berlin blockade. In 1948, he just cut off everything. All the roads, the railways, the canals leading into West Berlin, which, remember, was this little island of democracy deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany. His plan was to basically starve the 2 million people there until the Western Allies just gave up and left the city.
I mean, it seemed like a checkmate, right? Stalin had them backed into a corner. If they tried to break through the blockade on the ground, that could mean war. So, what on earth could they do? Their response was, well, it was genius and incredibly audacious. They went to the sky. The Berlin airlift was one of the most amazing logistical feats in all of history. For almost a whole year, American and British planes flew supplies in around the clock. A plane was landing every few minutes, bringing everything from food and coal to medicine. They kept an entire city alive from the air. It was a massive political victory and an absolute middle finger to Stalin's plan.
Eventually, Stalin had to back down and lift the blockade. But the crisis changed everything. It pretty much cemented the division of Germany into West and East. And crucially, it scared the Western powers enough that they realized they needed a formal military alliance to protect themselves.
And that's when the lines on the map were drawn in permanent ink. In 1949, the West created NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The core idea was simple. An attack on one member is an attack on all of them. The Soviet response, a few years later in 1955, was the Warsaw Pact, which was basically their own version, putting all the armies of Eastern Europe directly under Moscow's command. And what happens next? Well, just look at this. For the next 3.5 decades, both sides poured an unbelievable amount of money and resources into a massive military buildup. This wasn't just a political line on a map anymore. It was a militarized frontier. We're talking thousands of tanks, troops, and nuclear missiles all facing each other across the Iron Curtain, on constant high alert for an attack they both thought was coming any day.
And that's really where we have to leave it. The lines were drawn, the alliances were set. You had two superpowers, now both armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons, staring each other down across a divided continent. The entire world was just holding its breath, asking this one terrifying question. How long could this fragile, frozen peace possibly last?